Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys for being here. I hope you guys are doing well. So I received a couple of questions from our viewers. One person asked, is it true that if I marry a Filipina, I will have to support her entire family? Or do I have to support her entire family? A follow-up question to that, how come a lot of Filipinas support their families back home in the Philippines? I will answer these questions by discussing the topic of the breadwinner culture in the Philippines. If you are interested in this kind of topic, I hope you can stay in this video with me. All right, so let's get started. So there is a breadwinner culture in the Philippines. In Filipino society, there is a cultural expectation that the eldest child serves as the breadwinner of the family. Eldest daughters, which in Filipino term we call them ate or ates in plural form, they are customarily expected to serve as breadwinners for their families, both immediate and extended. For Filipinos, being a breadwinner means sacrificing yourself for the sake of the family. As I mentioned before, Filipino families are known for its strong family ties, and it is very common to extend generosity and help to each member of the family. With most families living in poverty, it is very difficult to ignore relatives who are in need, especially if they are asking for help. Now you may ask, why the eldest child and why daughters in particular? Now, in Filipino culture, the eldest child is expected to be the next head of the household. And in Filipino family structure, there is this hierarchy. You have the father as the head of the household, the mother, and then the eldest child is technically third in line. So in the absence of one of the parents, this eldest child is expected to step up and take those responsibilities. Now, even with both parents present, sometimes you will see it is common to see the eldest child working alongside the parent, especially if that family is struggling financially to support the livelihood of the family. Now, I've mentioned in one of my videos that nowadays I've noticed more and more single parent households in the Philippines, and in these cases a lot of times that single parent is usually working away from home to support the family. A lot of times that parent is working abroad or overseas. In these cases, I've seen the eldest child really step up and take the responsibilities of being a proxy parent or a guardian for those younger children, that the younger siblings. Now, for a Westerner, that may look unacceptable, but actually that's quite common in the Filipino family structure. Now, going back to the question, why daughters in particular? Now, Filipino children are raised to think that sacrificing yourself for the sake of the family is honorable, admirable, I don't know how to say it properly, and that devotion to the family will always bring a feeling of pride and satisfaction. So this is all about upbringing and training from childhood. And I've noticed, at least this is my observation, I've noticed that daughters tend to go above and beyond to please their parents and their families. And a lot of times, I've also noticed that daughters are most likely to be obedient and most likely to abide to this societal and cultural expectations. Now, in one article I saw from spot.ph, they call this the eldest daughter syndrome, the unique feeling that the firstborn girls have, or what a psychologist called the parentified sibling, for all the responsibilities they have in the family. So actually, this is not just about livelihood. As the eldest daughter, you do have a lot of responsibilities. You technically, in the absence of your mother, or even if she's there but she's too busy, you have a lot of responsibilities. You're basically like the second mom. Especially if she's not around, you are the mom. All right, I am back. I'm sorry, I had to step out and I changed my shirt. All right, so I was talking about the eldest daughter syndrome. Again, the Filipino daughters, the eldest daughters specifically, tend to be parentified. You have a lot of responsibilities to your family. Now, sons are a little bit different. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of breadwinners who are sons or sons who are breadwinners. There's also a lot of, sons who are breadwinners in the Philippines. But I've noticed, at least this is my personal observation, a lot of times when, they become adults, they get married, they have children, they tend to focus more on their own families. And a lot of times I also notice that they tend to help the family of their wife. Now, daughters are special because, again, especially if you are the eldest daughter, a lot of times you are parentified. They tend to be more obedient, to be more responsible, and more devoted not just to their parents but to the entire family. Now, another question to this, why do Filipinos take this responsibility of being the breadwinner? Now, there is a societal expectation. Filipinos consider this as the virtue of exhibiting love and respect for one's parents. Now, they call this in Asian culture filial piety. And as I mentioned before, majority of Filipinos are very religious. In fact, majority of Filipinos are Catholic. And a lot of Filipino parents quote this verse from the Bible that says, "Honor thy father and thy mother." And their interpretation of this is that for the child to take that role of being the breadwinner, basically to help and support the family. Now, I'm going to go through some challenges and struggles of the Filipino breadwinner, just to give you a little bit more context on this specific topic. So here's the first one, the first struggle, the first challenges, the first challenge. Which one is the correct word to use? All right, so the struggles of the Filipino breadwinner. So the first one, it is going to be very difficult to start their own family because there's going to be a lot of financial pressure. I think a lot of Filipinos can relate to this, especially young professionals. Right after college, a couple of years after you start working, a lot of them do want to start having a family, do want to start their own family, but you are faced with the reality that you're going to have to be ready to support three families: your parents and your siblings, your own family that you're going to start, and then your in-laws. That is the reality for a lot of Filipinos. So a lot of times, a lot of Filipinos do end up delaying this, this plan of getting married. In fact, in some cases, I've seen some waiting for their parents to pass before they get married. That is the sad reality in the Philippines. Now, for those who decide to get married, you're going to have to be ready to encounter and to face conflict. You're going to have to be ready to face conflict in the family because of this financial pressure. And you're going to encounter a lot of conflict, especially if the husband and the wife is not on board on what their priorities are. Because again, you're going to have to be ready to support a lot of people, your own family, parents, siblings, your own family that you just started, and then your in-laws, because everybody's going to want help. And this is the sad reality for a lot of Filipinos. And the reality is that nobody can sustain this kind of responsibilities. And a lot of Filipinos, again, do decide to wait until, there's a little bit less responsibility. And for some who decide to go through with a plan of getting married and starting a family, it can be quite complicated. All right, so the second challenge of being the Filipino breadwinner. You are going to be, as the breadwinner, you are going to be restricted from buying things you want or buying anything of luxury. Now, this is the sad reality for overseas Filipino workers. So basically everything they make, all the money they make abroad, they end up sending all of that to their families. Again, because of that, they can't really buy anything nice for themselves. It's all about sacrificing yourself for the family. Now, this third struggle, or should I say challenges of being a Filipino breadwinner, a lot of Filipinos can relate to this. Being the breadwinner, you become the bank, basically. I hate to say it, but you become the living emergency fund. Everybody expects you to have available funds once a problem occurs, once an emergency arises. And to be very honest, there's going to be a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of emergencies. Why? Because you are the only one, most likely, providing for everybody. So when someone is sick, someone is in the hospital, someone just had a baby, I mean, you name it, you can name so many emergency and so many problems that needs, dire attention. The sad thing is you are the one having to provide all the funds. And for a lot of Filipinos, it is very hard to say no, even if you don't have the resources to help. Why? Because there's a lot of guilt tripping. Again, this is all about upbringing and training. And you go through that, and then it's very hard for a lot of Filipinos to say no because, again, you can't say no because your parents will say certain things that will hurt your feelings, the family. I mean, a lot of guilt tripping happening here. And so you are forced to find other ways, and that may mean taking your own emergency fund. That may mean spending your own savings, or at worst, taking a personal loan. So a lot of Filipinos find themselves in debt. Filipinos who are working abroad, they find themselves taking out a loan just to cover someone's medical expenses. Again, this is a very, very hard situation. The next challenge for Filipino breadwinners is that a lot of this, it ends up taking an emotional toll on the person. The emotional toll of being the breadwinner is profound. constantly worrying about meeting financial obligations, coupled with the pressure to support loved ones, can lead to emotional exhaustion and strain on the mental health. There's actually a problem on this because a lot of overseas Filipino workers working abroad are depressed, sad, just a lot of anxiety because again you're constantly faced with these problems and emergencies, and you're the only one having to provide for everybody. It's a lot of responsibility. All right, the last one, and I think this is one of the biggest challenge because okay, I'm going to mention it. It is the dependency issues. Over time, family members may become overly dependent on the breadwinner, creating a cycle of reliance. This is the biggest problem. I've noticed a lot of overseas Filipino workers working abroad for decades. You would be lucky. It would be a blessing to have family members who actually are very proactive. They start their own little business. So by the time you go back home, you're now retired as an OFW, you come back home to something. There's some source of income for you. But a lot of times they basically spend their entire day, they give all of that money to their family, and then by the time they're retired, they go back to zero, nothing. These family members did not do anything. They were just expecting for that remittance money, that allowance every month, and they got used to that, to that kind of life, not really being proactive, there's a lot of laziness, to be very honest. So very reliant on that one person, doing all the work. This person is now retired, you go back, that person do end up going back to zero with nothing. Again, that's one reason why a lot of people are stuck in poverty. And you, as the OFW who spent your life working for decades, you now is the one enabling this cycle of dependence, because you may have a niece or a nephew that you sent to school, and this niece or nephew will repeat the kind of cycle. Now you're expecting this niece or nephew to support you in your old age. This is not a good cycle, and actually, honestly, this is one reason why the country remains to be in poverty. So what do I think of this culture? So another person asked this question. He said, so I met this Filipina. I really love her. I want to marry her, but she happens to be the eldest child and the eldest daughter at that. So is that a bad idea? Should I back out and not marry her? I'm sorry, my stomach is growling. I'm hungry. Okay, so my answer to this question is going to be based on my personal experience, my personal observation, of course, my opinion. I know that some people will not agree to this, but especially Filipinos, but this is my opinion and we can all agree to disagree. All right, so answering that question. Now, not every Filipino abides by this culture. And this is where it's going to be very important to have that discussion before you even think of marriage. Discuss this with your Filipina fiance. What is her stance on this issue? Because this is very, very important. A lot of people skip this, but this will end up to be one of the most important decisions you will make, to have this discussion even before you propose. You have to know what is her stance on this. Because again, this is all about upbringing and training and culture. Is she willing to compromise? Because there has to be a compromise on this one. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it's a compromise because you're marrying a foreigner. You know what? That's not necessarily the case. A lot of Filipinos married to Filipinos as well have the same thing, challenges that, Filipinos married to foreigners. It might be a little bit different with a foreigner because there's other expectations that I can talk about in a separate video. I don't want to make this video too long. So again, discuss that with your Filipina, and as I was saying, not every Filipino abides by this culture. Now, what I've noticed is that a lot of times when the Filipina, for example, a Filipina marries an American, for the first couple of years, especially if she starts working here in the US, she might help for a couple of years or maybe even several years, help and support her families back home in the Philippines, especially if she still has siblings who are, going to school, especially college. Now, sooner or later, she will soon realize that she really cannot sustain supporting everybody. Nobody can sustain, nobody can do that kind of responsibility. It's just too much. Nobody can support everybody. That's the reality. And if she loves you and if she loves your family that you are now starting together, especially if you have children, her priority should be your family. I think there's a little bit of what should I call this? There's a little bit of confusion when it comes to the meaning of family. I guess I should rephrase this. There's a confusion when it comes to priorities. Now, when you start your own family, you get married, especially when you start having children, your family, immediate family, and your priority should be that family. Does that make sense? Because a lot of times I have also heard of this many stories, because this is actually one big issue that a lot of Filipinos don't want to talk about because it's a sensitive issue and you get attacked by others when you talk about these things. So there's a lot of Filipinos who marry interracial couples, Filipinas specifically married to Americans, who have this kind of who go through this kind of problems because they're confused. Who is my family? They think, of course, as I mentioned, your parents, your siblings, they are your family. But once you get married, your family, your priority should be your husband and your children. I've heard of complaints coming from other foreigners. In fact, some of the comments saying that I really hate it that my wife, she is working, not the wife that he hates, but what she's doing. She's working full time, but all of her income goes to her family. She can't even buy food or buy clothes for the kids. Now, that is very wrong. It doesn't matter what culture, I think that is wrong. Your priority should be your husband and your children. And this is also where you're going to have to think, what really do you want to abide by? The culture, or at least for Christians, or the Bible? Because a lot of this culture, I would say, is against the Bible. A lot of times they would start, saying things, oh, this is the culture, this is this is that. But what does the Bible say about it? Your priority should be your husband and your children. Now, again, nothing is wrong with helping your family because, as we know, life in the Philippines is not easy. But again, you should know, she should know, the Filipina should know her priorities. Now, a lot of Filipinos realize that this culture of, the breadwinner culture is actually not all healthy. In fact, for some, it's not healthy at all. In fact, this is one of the reasons why a lot of Filipinos are stuck in poverty. They can't get ahead because they're stuck in these responsibilities. A lot of Filipinos find themselves stuck, and they realize that allowing others to be dependent on one person is not good. In fact, everyone must pull their own weight and help each other out. And helping should be done out of the goodness of one's heart. Expecting one person to carry all of the burden and to sacrifice themselves for everybody is unfair, in fact, very brutal. As I've mentioned, those 5 main struggles for Filipino breadwinners, it can be very brutal. A lot of Filipinos go through so much hardship, sacrificing themselves. And the sad reality is some would even sacrifice their own family, their husband and their children, for the sake of their parents and siblings. Now, some people say that is noble because that's your family. Again, people are confused. Who is your family and who is your priority? They're all your family, but your immediate family is your husband and your children, and that should be your priority. Now, another thing I have to add is that the husband and the wife have to be on board on this. Again, a lot of people tend to think that this is just a problem between Filipinas marrying foreigners who are married to foreigners. That is not the case. In fact, I hear this a lot within Filipino families. A lot of people do end up separating because in Filipino families it's even more complicated because you're not just dealing with your own parents and siblings. There are in-laws. So, for example, I've heard this a lot with overseas Filipino worker. The husband goes to work abroad, and then now, of course, he has to support his wife and his children. Now, the wife is also supporting her family. That money is coming from the husband's, hard work from abroad. And he also has to support his own family. Now, there's so many people he has to support. No wonder why people can't get ahead. No one can have their savings because there's no savings. When there's an emergency, everybody's going to ask that one person. Again, this is not good. So with most families living in poverty, it can be very difficult to say no when a family member is asking for help. But support and help should be given from a place of strength and generosity, not out of fear or societal obligation. As the popular saying goes, give a person a fish and they eat for a day. Teach them to fish and they eat for a lifetime. This saying encapsulates the difference between enabling and supporting. Giving a person a solution to a problem may bring a short-term benefit, but in the long term, it fosters dependence, which is a big problem in the Philippines. That erodes a person, that dependence erodes a person's ability to develop their own capacities and fully claim their own successes. As I mentioned, this is a big problem in the Philippines. Now, I'm not saying every family in the Philippines, because I've seen families who are very proactive, and those families, they do end up moving up. If you have one person working abroad and then the families back home are very proactive, they start their own little business, whether that's a piggery or they buy a land to farm, or maybe even a small sari-sari store that they develop into a bigger store in town. And then by the time that person from abroad goes back home to retire, there is something going on back home. Now, there's a lot of families who are not proactive. In fact, they're not doing anything. They're just waiting for that monthly allowance, that remittance to come, and they're so dependent on that. That is a big problem, because again, that creates a cycle of dependency and a cycle of, what do you call it? The cycle of reliance. Okay, let me answer another question before I end this video. When it comes to helping the family, as I mentioned, life in the Philippines is very difficult. That's the reality. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't help the family, that you should forget where you came from, that you should forget everybody. What I'm saying is you should prioritize your own family. Your husband, your children, your child or your children, that is your priority. Do not break the family for the sake of your family back home, because I've seen this a lot of stories, very sad stories on this. Filipinas do end up getting divorced because they want to help their families back home. They're not contributing to their livelihood here in the US, and the husband, sooner or later, he will get tired of that. And in fact, that's not just Filipinas married to foreigner. That happens a lot in the Philippines. I guess nobody's talking about it, but I hear a lot of stories, sad stories on that. But yes, you should prioritize your husband and your children. That is your immediate family. Now, helping the family. When it comes to helping the family, if you have aging parents in the Philippines who can no longer work because they're old and they need support, then yes, that is the priority too. But your husband, your spouse have to be on board of that. Now, a lot of Americans are very generous people. They know the situation. If they see that you have old or aging parents, most likely they will be more than happy to help. I think a lot of Americans feel tired and feel the need to complain when it's too much. Now, some Filipinos would say, well, Americans don't care about family. This is another stereotype that's very negative towards Americans. And I'm saying this because I've heard of this a lot. People will say that, well, Americans, they're not family oriented. They don't care about families. Actually, they do. But they're reasonable. They're logical people. If they see that you have an aging parents and your parents can no longer work and support themselves, they will be more than happy to help the aging parents. Now, again, it's all about priorities. Everybody in the family back home who are able-bodied, is that the word? They can work, they are healthy, they are strong, they can support themselves. They should find a job and support themselves. You shouldn't be supporting people who are of working age and, they can support themselves. Now, let's talk about the nieces and the nephews, because that seems to be a big topic there. A lot of course, those kids obviously can't work for themselves. But you know what? If you really think about it, you cannot keep on supporting everybody else's children. Again, your priority is your child, especially if you have your own children, that should be your priority. Sometimes you would find that some people in the Philippines, siblings, relatives, they would use the children to get you. Is that the word? Like they would have no, it's not for me. The help is for the child. Well, first of all, you need to teach them how to be responsible. Why would you even have a child if you can't support yourself? See, that's a big problem. A lot of people will use these children to get you to help them. Very sad. They can't even support themselves, but then they would get pregnant, and then now there's this child, and you being the good person, being the generous person, oh yeah, well, yeah, I'm not really helping the adult, I'm helping the child. No, don't do that. Let them be responsible for their own action, because the reality is, if you allow them to actually do something, they will eventually do something, So I'm saying, prioritize. It's all about priority. If you have an aging parents, most likely your husband would be on board when it comes to supporting the aging parents. But supporting everybody who can actually work and support themselves, Let them get a job and let them fish for themselves. That's how I'm gonna end this video. I will see you guys on my next one. Bye everyone.